Good evening. My name is George Takis, and I'm here to teach you tonight about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now you should have your camera ready and you should have your battery charged. Also, it's a good idea to have your manual handy because I'm not going to be talking about any specific camera brand. I'm just talking about generalities and things that are specific to good exposure and good camera handling. And these lessons are going to be short, bite-sized lessons. So let's get started. Somewhere on your LCD, either on the back of the camera or on top of your camera, you will find that there are three areas of concern tonight. One of them is your shutter speed, the other one is the aperture, and the final one is the ISO. You should know how to control these. That's the important thing for tonight's lesson. Be sure you know how to change each one of these. Now on some, you have a control dial at the back or a control wheel that will change the shutter speed and another one on the front that may change the aperture or vice versa. On some models, there's only a wheel at the back and there's usually a button on the top or a button down on the back that you have to hold and at the same time turn your selection dial. That will change the aperture. The ISO can be changed by pressing down on the ISO button if you have one on top or on the back, or possibly you have an ISO setting on the screen that you can access. You should learn how to access that through your manual. Once you access that and hit the select button, you will find that the ISOs will come up on the back of your camera LCD. Okay, so let's just move on. Exposure basics is what I'm going to talk about tonight, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So let's get started. But before we do, it's really important for you to understand that I'm going to be talking about traditional settings when it comes to shutter speeds and apertures. While you will find that your camera has settings in between, in other words, between the traditional apertures and shutter speeds, there are two more that the camera can break down into finer units. These are great for fine tuning later on, fine tuning your exposures, but we're going to disregard them. So that means if you're on a standard shutter speed, you need to go 3 clicks to get to the next standard shutter speed. Similarly, if you're on a standard or traditional aperture, you'll need to go 3 clicks to get to the next traditional aperture. This is just something that you can mess around with, but be sure you understand that we're going to be only talking about traditional shutter speeds and apertures. Okay, here is a lineup of shutter speeds. Now, I started at 1,000th of a second all the way down to 4 seconds. The first group are all fractions. The last group are full seconds. These are denoted by the inch mark. So once you hit the inch mark, you know you are into whole numbers and whole seconds. Many of you will have even smaller fractions of a second, like 1,000th, 2,000th, 4,000, and so on, where you will also have longer shutter speeds, which means that you will have 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 16 seconds, and so on, all the way up to 30 seconds of controlled shutter time. After that, there are two other settings possible in most cameras, B and T. You may only have B. We are going to disregard those for this evening's class. That's something that will come up in another lesson. Okay, if you go from 1/500th of a second to 1/250th of a second, you're going to double the time. Shutter speed is all about duration or time. And if you go from 1/250th of a second to 125th of a second, again, you're talking about lengthening the time, doubling it. Each time we go in this direction, we're doubling the time. If we go in the other direction, we're halving the time. So by using traditional shutter speeds that are shown here, you will either double your time or half your time. Now, we will call faster or shorter shutter speeds if you go into the fractions of a second. The higher the fraction, then the faster the shutter speed is considered to be. Or if you go in the other direction, we consider that slower or longer shutter speeds. Now, going in either of these directions, you will either be able to stop action or blur action. So going into the higher fractions, you will stop action. Going into the longer shutter speeds, you will blur action. What that means is this is your creative control. You can use shutter speed technically to control exposure time, but by controlling time, you can also control the creative aspects of shutter speed, which is stopping action or blurring action. Here's a couple of examples. So what we have here is a stop action and a blur action shot. The left is stop action. You can see how each drop can almost be seen in the waterfall, whereas on the right-hand side, you will have blurred action. The other thing that you can do with shutter speed is if you select a long enough shutter speed, and I'm not talking too long, I'm saying a 30th or a 15th of a second on something that's moving, such as this train or a car or vehicle, it could be a bicycle, anything that has lateral motion or straight motion and can be followed with your camera, you can pan action. What happens with pan action is that your camera will follow the action of the moving object, and the long shutter speed, again, not too long, 30th of a second, maybe a 15th, you take the shot and the relative position of the camera to the subject is the same. What will be blurred is the background. This will be a good way of showing motion. Okay, so that's our shutter speeds. It's a good idea to make sure that you know how to control your shutter speeds quickly. In other lessons, we'll be talking about how to take photographs and get the proper exposure every time. But right now, let's move on to aperture. So here are your apertures: f2.8, f4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22, 32. Now again, these are the traditional apertures. There are usually two apertures in between on most cameras, but we'll ignore those. So if you're at 2.8, it'll be 3 clicks to get to f4, 3 clicks to get to f5.6. In case you are wondering, the F stands for focal because the relationship, the size of the aperture is related to the focal length of the lens. We won't be getting into that technicality tonight, but at a future class, we may do that. Okay, f2.8, which is the smaller number, is the larger aperture, whereas f32, which is a larger number, represents the smaller aperture. In future classes, this will be made clear as to why this happens, but right now, it's sufficient for you to know that the aperture size is opposite to the numbering. So, large aperture opening with a small f-stop. Large f-stop, small opening. Again, in this particular case, if on your lens f2.8 is the largest aperture that it's able to achieve, that's known as the maximum effective aperture of the lens. And you'll find that maximum effective aperture designated as a ratio on your lens. In this case, it'll be 1 to 2.8. Besides controlling exposure by the amount, aperture also controls something called depth of field, or DOF. And depth of field is something, again, that we'll cover in a future class as to how it works and how to take advantage of it. For now, you have to understand that there's more light allowed in with the smaller f-stop number and less light allowed in with the larger f-stop number. If you go from f16 to f11, then you're allowing twice the light in. And if you go from f11 to f8, you're allowing twice the amount in again. So with aperture, as with shutter speed, it's a halving and doubling. And that's going to make it very easy for us for our math. If you go the other way, obviously from F8 to F11, it's going to be halving the amount. From F11 to F16, it's going to be halving the previous amount again. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, let's bring the two of those together, shutter speed and aperture, time and amount. Let's have a look at those. So here we go. We have the shutter speed at the top, the aperture is at the bottom. So if you let this amount of light in, F8, for this amount of time, 125th of a second, we will consider that a good exposure. Now, in fact, it might not be for any particular situation. This is hypothetical, obviously. So let's say at 125th of a second at f8, that's the right time and the right amount for a certain scene, and it gives us proper exposure. But if you double or half one of these, you either have to double or half the other one to even things out again. So for example, if I go to 1/250th of a second because I want a faster shutter speed, then I would have to double the amount. So from f8, I'd have to go to f5.6. I've half the time, and in order to get the same exposure, I have to double the amount. And if I half the time again, I have to double the amount again. If I half the time again, I have to double the time again. And obviously, the same thing in the opposite direction. Now, but if you're here, for example, if you're at 1,000th of a second at f2.8, and f2.8 is your maximum effective aperture of your lens, that means you cannot open up your lens anymore. But let's say you want to go to 1/2000th of a second. If you did, and you couldn't open up your aperture, now you have half the time, and consequently, your image will be underexposed. So what do? All you have to do is change the sensitivity of the camera. If you change the sensitivity or double the sensitivity, say you're at 100 ISO and you double the sensitivity, that means now you can go to 1,000 or 2,000th of a second, because at 2,000th of a second, you've half the time. Couldn't double the amount, but if you double the sensitivity, it gives you the same results. And of course, that brings into ISO. So let's talk a little bit about ISO. Now, ISO is a setting that's on your camera. In previous days with film cameras, you had to buy a specific ISO film. With digital cameras, the beauty is you can change your sensitivity to anything you want. And ISO is the sensitivity setting for your camera. And here they are: 100 ISO, 200 ISO, 400, 800, 1600, 3200. The numbering is easy. The lower the number, the less sensitive your camera is to light. The higher the number, the more sensitive your camera is to light. So in well-lit situations, 100, 200 ISO will do. For example, if you're outside, sunny conditions, 100, 200 ISO is absolutely fantastic. But as you get into shadier circumstances, or if you get into indoor situation where the lighting isn't as bright, then you might have to increase your sensitivity to 1600, 3200. Now, usually most cameras don't have anything lower than 100. There have been a few that have been manufactured at 50 ISO, okay? But 3200, yeah, they go higher. And I'm sure you'll find that yours goes higher as well. And the one thing that goes along with going higher is you get more noise. The lower the ISO, the less noise you have. The higher the ISO, the more noise you have. And you might be asking me, well, what's noise? Well, back in the day, they used to call it grain. It still looks grainy, but because it's digital, it's considered to be noise rather than grain. Grain is for film, noise is for digital images. So here we have less noise at the lower ISOs, more noise at the higher ISOs. Now, there are some photographers that use this to their advantage because they want a grainy looking picture for perhaps artistic reasons. But be aware that the higher you go, the more noise you have. Modern cameras are overcoming the noise problem, and you'll find that your higher ISOs don't have as much noise as older generation digital cameras. So if you go from 100 to 200 ISO, you're doubling the sensitivity. If you go from 3200 to 1600 in the opposite direction, you halve the sensitivity. So it's a doubling and halving, and that's the beauty of it. You have shutter speeds that double in half, you have ISOs that double in half, you have apertures that double in half. It's all doubling and halving, and consequently the math is easy. And once you end up with a certain shutter speed and aperture at a certain ISO, if you decide to change one of those, you have to change one of the other ones. Either double it or half it, depending on in which direction you're going to be going. So here, getting back to the shutter speed and aperture, 1/2000th of a second at f2.8. If you double that ISO, then you have a good exposure again. And you can keep doing that. If you want to go to 1/4000th of a second, then you'd have to go to 400 ISO. And it's that easy. So that brings us to the conclusion of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO in this bite-sized photography lesson. And what I'd ask for is if you give us a like and please subscribe. But by all means, thank you very much for attending this class. I appreciate it.